Okay, maybe we can start. So, thank you all very much for coming. I'm really delighted to have Brubaker here in UCD. Brubaker is really world-leading author on ethnicity, nationalism, immigration, citizenship. Has written, I think, 4 path-breaking books. Most recently, Nationalist Politics and Everyday Ethnicity in Transylvanian Town, which is a combination of theoretical analysis and ethnographic analysis at the same time. So inclusion. And then Ethnicity and Groups, which is a really excellent book, theoretical compilation of different articles questioning the whole idea of groupness. That was published in 2004. Then Nationalism Reframed, Nationhood and National Question in New Europe, published in 1996, which focuses on transformations in the post-communist world, particularly in the Soviet Union, and the importance of nationalism during the communist period. And finally, the Citizenship and Nationhood in France and Germany, which relates to the comparison of French and Germany since policies. And so thank you very much for coming. And today's talk is on language, religion, and thought.
Thanks a lot, Sinisa, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for coming out on this gorgeous day. Language and religion are obviously huge subjects. Each is the focus not only of a distinct sociological subfield, but even, let's say, in the case of language, of an entire discipline. To address both in a single talk is a risky and perhaps foolhardy enterprise, and I'm very aware that nearly every sentence that I'm about to utter could be challenged and would have to be heavily qualified. So I ask for your indulgence. I don't want to get lost in thickets of qualifications, so I will not try to cover myself by engaging in endless qualifications, but clearly can bring out some of the complexities in the discussion. So I'm approaching language and religion from a particular analytical angle. As a student of ethnicity and nationalism, of immigration and citizenship, I've long been interested in the social organization and the political expression of cultural difference. And it seems to me that language and religion are arguably the 2 most socially and politically consequential domains of cultural difference in the modern world. As a result, the study of the political accommodation of cultural difference, or what you could call the political sociology of multiculturalism, or simply the politics of difference, would seem to require sustained attention to both language and religion. But there have been few attempts to compare language and religion in a sustained way. The outstanding exception and an important inspiration for this paper being a paper by Ari Zolberg and Yifeng Wang. Now, it's of course the case that language and religion are often discussed together in the literatures on ethnicity and nationalism, on minority rights, and multiculturalism, but most of these discussions involve passing juxtaposition rather than sustained comparison, while the more sustained comparisons have tended to be normative, as done by political theorists, rather than empirical. Now, you could argue that this lack of sustained comparison is not surprising, since language and religion simply aren't comparable. And I don't want to get sidetracked here by going into a discussion of what it means to be comparable. My interests are substantive, they're not methodological. And of course, you can construe religion and language in such a way that they aren't comparable. So if you construe religion in terms of beliefs or rituals, for example, then you wouldn't have any leverage for comparison. And obviously, religion, at least what we call organized religion, has a crucial organizational dimension and a structure of authority that language lacks. And I'm going to come back to this point later. And there are many other ways in which language and religion are simply not comparable, but I want to argue that one can construe language and religion in a way that makes comparison possible and fruitful. And my strategy for doing so is to begin by aligning both with ethnicity and nationhood, and by sketching 5 ways in which language and religion are both similar to ethnicity and nationhood and intertwined with them. I would say similarly intertwined with them. And I will then move on to identify some key differences between language and religion and draw out their implications for the politics of difference. It's obviously not a full comparative analysis here, whatever that would mean, but I'm hoping that the friction of comparison generated by trying to think or read one domain of cultural practice against another can suggest some potentially fruitful lines of analysis. So just to preview where I'm going, I want to argue that religious pluralism tends to be more intergenerationally robust and more deeply institutionalized than linguistic pluralism in contemporary liberal societies, and that religious pluralism entails deeper and more divisive forms of diversity. And the upshot, I will argue, is that religion has tended to displace language as the cutting edge of contestation over the political accommodation of cultural difference, reversing a longer-term pattern in which language, over the course of several centuries, displaced religion. Okay, so I want to begin by aligning language and religion with ethnicity and nationalism. And I'll start by noting that both language and religion are what I will call domains of categorically differentiated cultural practice that simultaneously unite and divide. What do I mean by categorically differentiated? I mean that language and religion are understood by both participants and observers as partitioned into discrete categories rather than simply some kind of continuous spectrum of variation. Now, that they are understood in this way is, of course, a product of history and politics. It's a product of the history and politics of what you might call objectification and individuation and boundary drawing that have created what we know as distinct languages out of, say, dialect continua, and distinct religions out of fluid and varying sets of practices. So in popular understandings, both language and religion sort people into distinct, bounded, and largely self-reproducing communities, and in this way they are both analogous to ethnic groups and nations and variously intertwined with them. Secondly, language and religion are basic sources and forms of social, cultural, and political identification. That is, they are ways of identifying oneself and others, they're ways of construing sameness and difference, they're ways of naming fundamental social groups. Language and religion in this respect are again both analogous to ethnicity and nationalism and pervasively intertwined with them in the sense that language or religion or both together are generally understood as central to or even as constitutive of most ethnic and national identifications and serve often as the key diacritical markers or emblems or symbols of such identifications. Thirdly, and again, this is like ethnic and national identifications, language and religion are generally transmitted in the family, big qualification here, of course. Indeed, language and religion are ordinarily more central, you could argue, more central to primary socialization in the family than are ethnic and national identifications, and they are therefore often deeply taken for granted and deeply embodied identifications, and both are routinely represented as primordial, yet fourth, neither religion nor language is, of course, in fact, primordial or fixed, and the same, of course, holds for ethnicity and nationhood. Like ethnicity and nationhood, both religion and language are powerfully shaped by political and economic and cultural processes, and they change as circumstances change. You could also argue that in the contemporary world, both are increasingly chosen rather than given. Finally, many of the claims made in the name of religious or linguistic groups are similar to, and again intertwined with, the claims made in the name of ethnic groups or nations. These include claims for economic resources, for symbolic recognition, for cultural reproduction, for equal representation, for political autonomy, and so on. So in all these respects, language and religion are both similar to ethnicity and nationalism, and they are similarly intertwined with them. And this has led scholars of ethnicity to treat language and religion implicitly or explicitly as functionally equivalent. And I would go further and say that ethnicity was actually constituted as an object of study, as a field of study, precisely by abstracting from the specificities of language, from the specificities of religion, and from the specificities of other things like phenotype or region of origin, customary mode of livelihood, and so on. So this moment of abstraction, this movement of abstraction, this call to abstract from cultural content was given its strongest formulation by Frederick Barth, who famously argued that the study of ethnicity should focus on the nature and dynamics of ethnic boundaries, not on what he somewhat dismissively called the cultural stuff that the boundaries enclose. And this has been an immensely fruitful perspective. It's been important for my own work, but it's also inevitably flattening because it neglects, deliberately so, the specific cultural practices, understandings, and institutions that are implicated in the construction and working of ethnic identities and boundaries. So what I want to do in this talk is follow the lead of scholars such as Stephen Cornell and Richard Jenkins in returning the so-called cultural stuff, in this case specifically language and religion, to the center of analytical attention. And I think this is important, not just for a richer understanding of ethnicity, but for a richer understanding of multiculturalism and the politics of difference. So the intuition motivating this move is that there's limited use in talking about multiculturalism or the politics of difference in highly generalized terms that don't attend in detail to the specificities of different forms of difference. So I don't think we can profitably talk about multiculturalism in terms of a generalized notion of identity or culture or difference or identity, but rather we need to look at specific domains of cultural practice, precisely because the problem of the political accommodation of cultural difference is not posed in the abstract, it's posed in significantly differing ways for religious pluralism on the one hand and for linguistic pluralism on the other. Now, I want to register two caveats, though, about this focusing on the cultural stuff. The first is that the phrase is potentially misleading if it's taken to imply an opposition between culture and social organization. So I want to talk about language and religion not only as cultural forms, but also as modes of social organization and media of interaction and so on. The second caveat is that the contemporary politics of difference has been shaped not only by the intrinsic properties of language and religion, considered as some kind of ahistorical, cultural, social, organizational stuff, but also shaped, and I would say more profoundly shaped, by specific historical trajectories, by the specific legacies of the ways in which states have dealt with religious difference and linguistic difference in the past, especially at certain key moments where certain settlements, institutional and durable settlements were arrived at. So the states we know today as liberal and national states became liberal and national precisely in and through their confrontation with religious and linguistic heterogeneity. And I can't really develop that historical point very much in this talk, but it's there in the background. So before I go on and get into more into the substance of this talk, I want to underscore one final preliminary point, which is that language is a much more definite and less elusive analytical object than religion. Now, of course, linguistic phenomena are immensely complex, but for all that complexity, linguistic phenomena have a definiteness, a regularity that religious phenomena lack. Because we know what we're talking about when we talk about language. But the same can't be said necessarily for religion. Therefore, many scholars have argued that that the category of religion is a meaningless or useless analytical category, but I'm not aware that scholars of language have made the same claim about the category of language per se. So, while fully acknowledging the problematic status of the category of religion, I don't want to go into debate about that category here. The scope of my argument is limited to contemporary liberal polities, and I'm willing to work here with a relatively or extremely unreflexive common sense category of religion, limiting my attention primarily to what we call organized religion, and within that field primarily to the Abrahamic religions. And one of the reasons for limiting the field to organized religion is that it kind of pushes to the side this whole question about whether this whole tremendous growth in things like spirituality and so on are part of the domain of religion or are some other phenomenon. So now I want to begin going into the differences, some differences between language and religion, and I want to begin, in a sense, on the opposite end of where I'm going to end up. That is, I'm going to begin with an observation that suggests that it should be language rather than religion that is more deeply and intrinsically politicized under modern conditions. What do I mean by modern conditions? Just very broadly, conditions characterized by the modern state and by modern capitalist economy. Why is this the case? Well, language, after all, is a pervasive and universal medium of social life. Well, religion is not. Yes, you can define religion sufficiently broadly so that religion too can be seen as a universal social phenomenon, but it's not universal in the same way. That is, language is a pervasive, inescapable medium of social interaction. Religion is not. Language is a necessary medium of public as well as private life. It's an inescapable medium of public discourse, government, administration, law, courts, media, public signage. And however one defines religion, it can't be said to be an inescapable medium or necessary ground of action in any of these domains. So what is, especially if we think of the modern, okay, so religion is not an inescapable medium of action in the sense that that language is. Now, so as a real public life can in principle be a-religious, but it can't be a-linguistic, especially if we think of the modern state as it had developed in the West by the late 19th century. What do we mean by that? Well, what are the main characteristics of the modern state? Well, characterized by direct rule, by intensive interaction with citizens, by universal public education, a public sector that provides large numbers of jobs. All of these factors mean that the rules and practices that govern the language of public life directly affect the material and ideal interests of people with differing language repertoires. And any state like Ireland, which has politics of language, any state, any people living in any such a country know what this means in very concretely, that the rules that govern language practices affect the material and ideal interests of people with different language repertoires. Especially in an economic context in which work is increasingly semantic and communicative rather than physical, as Gellner put it, involving the manipulation of meanings rather than simply the manipulation of things. So language is chronically and pervasively politicized in all linguistically heterogeneous modern societies. Now, religion is also, of course, politicized, but it's politicized in differing ways and for different reasons. The state must privilege a particular language or set of languages, but it need not privilege a particular religion, at least not in the same way and not to the same degree. Again, I want to qualify this. Yes, it's easy to identify pervasive traces of Christianity in the public life of all Western liberal democracies, even in those with the strongest traditions of separation of church and state, or laïcité. You need only think of such taken for granted frameworks as the reckoning of dates according to the Christian calendar, or the organization of holidays, or the privileging of Sunday as a day of rest. But even if complete neutrality is a myth, still, contemporary liberal polities, and I include even those that still have some kind of residual established church, all such polities have made substantial, though contested, moves toward a more neutral stance toward differing religions. And such moves have no counterpart in the domain of language. That is, the state can approach a certain kind of neutrality with respect to religion, even if neutrality can't be fully realized in practice. But it can't even approach neutrality with respect to language. And there's a second reason for thinking that language should be more deeply and chronically politicized than language in the contemporary world. According to secularization theory, modernity, after all, has entailed the progressive privatization and hence the depoliticization of religion. Now, of course, events of the last 3 decades or so have made it easy to criticize secularization theory. But as many leading sociologists of religion have suggested, secularization theory is in fact more complex and interesting and robust than critics suggest, and it can't simply be dismissed out of hand. For many in the modern world, religion has indeed become a more individual, a more subjective, a more private experience. And to the extent that this is the case, then religion indeed becomes, or can become, depoliticized. And religious pluralism, or heterogeneity, can flourish in the private realm without generating conflict in the public sphere. So if you look at the last several centuries, if you take a temporal perspective that goes over centuries, religion has indeed become much less central to public life and less politically contentious in the West, while language has become much more central and more contentious. Yet, while secularization theory captures this very important long-term trend, there's a powerful medium-term counter-trend towards what Jose Casanova has called the de-privatization, and therefore the re-politicization of religion. And here, if you take a timescale of decades instead of centuries, I think you certainly see that conflicts over religion have intensified, and I want to argue a little bit later that over this time span of decades, conflicts over language have eased. As a result, while religion is not necessarily or not chronically or pervasively politicized the way language is in a contemporary polity, the challenges posed by religious pluralism today, at least by some forms of religious pluralism, tend to be more complex and difficult than those posed by linguistic pluralism. So I want to develop this argument in two stages. I want first to argue that religious pluralism tends to be more robust than linguistic pluralism in contemporary liberal societies and polities. And then secondly, I want to argue that religious pluralism entails more divisive and more deep forms of diversity than does linguistic pluralism. So let me begin with the greater robustness of religious pluralism. This results from the differing ways in which religious and linguistic pluralism are generated, reproduced, and institutionalized in contemporary liberal societies. So I want to consider each of these in turn, starting with the generation of pluralism, where does it come from, and then moving on to address the reproduction and the institutionalization of pluralism. So start with the generation of pluralism. Conquest, colonization, and today, of course, especially migration, generate religious and linguistic pluralism in similar ways. They import it from without. But religious pluralism is also generated from within. And I'm not concerned here with those relatively rare, though historically crucial, cases of religious splits and foundings. I'm concerned rather with routine, individual-level changes in religious affiliation and identity. Now, of course, there are also such routine, individual-level changes in linguistic repertoire. But the ways in which people change linguistic repertoires are different, and they have different consequences. So for adults, at least, language change is mainly additive, while religious change is often substitutive and transformative. Of course, again, one could qualify this. There may be, even when adults learn new languages, there may be some attrition of the original language if they're not using it and so on. But when adults add a new language to an existing repertoire of languages, this may inflect their identity, but it's unlikely to transform it. But when they convert from one religion to another, or from one form of religious engagement, one manner of religious engagement to another, this can involve a basic transformation of identity. People don't ordinarily simply add a new religion to a repertoire of religions, notwithstanding the flourishing, of course, of various forms of hybridity and syncretism, nor do they ordinarily convert from one language to another. Now, for children of immigrants, to be sure, language change is often substitutive rather than additive, but this kind of substitutive change generally reduces heterogeneity within the host society, while religious conversion often increases heterogeneity. Not always. Conversion sometimes also increases, conversion sometimes decreases heterogeneity, as it makes people more homogeneous. And some immigrant groups to the U.S., for example, notably Taiwanese, exhibit high rates of conversion to Christianity. But pressures and incentives for conversion to the prevailing religion are on the whole relatively weak in contemporary liberal societies, while incentives to learn the prevailing language, or one of the prevailing languages, are very strong. A whole series of factors, in addition to immigration, promote religious pluralization in contemporary liberal societies. These include new religious movements, organized proselytism, transnational religious networks, an open religious marketplace. All of these, plus a general climate of spiritual experimentation, all of these promote increasing heterogeneity in the domain of religion. But there are no analogous forces promoting linguistic pluralization from within. So the upshot is that in contemporary liberal societies, new forms and new degrees of linguistic pluralism come from without. They're mainly imported through immigration, while new forms and degrees of religious pluralism are both imported and endogenously generated. Now, the second reason for the greater robustness of religious than linguistic pluralism is that religious pluralism is more easily reproduced. And here I want to shift my perspective from intra-generational changes to intergenerational change and reproduction. And here I want also to draw a very broad and crude contrast between pre-modern and modern societies. We were just talking, as Cindy said earlier, about Gellner's mode of theorizing. So I want to indulge in a little bit of Gellnerian theorizing from some Olympic vantage point where you can just look at pre-modern and contemporary society. I think it's useful. So in pre-modern societies, linguistic pluralism was more or less self-reproducing. That is, linguistic socialization occurred in families and local communities, and it didn't require any specialized apparatus. Political authorities made no effort to impose linguistic homogeneity, though they may have imposed religious homogeneity. In contemporary liberal societies, on the other hand, the situation is reversed. It's now religious pluralism that's more or less self-reproducing. Religious socialization occurs in families and local religious communities. Political authorities, again, in liberal societies, make no effort to impose religious homogeneity by definition, otherwise they wouldn't be liberal. But linguistic reproduction now requires what Gellner called exo-socialization, socialization from without. It requires prolonged and expensive schooling on a scale that only the state is ordinarily in a position to provide. So the state is much more central today to linguistic than it is to religious reproduction. Now, of course, children can and do acquire basic competence in minority languages from their parents and extended families, and this can be reinforced by minority language media. But without comprehensive schooling in that language, it's difficult for the minority language to be fully reproduced. Now, some countries with long-established, territorially concentrated linguistic minorities do, of course, provide comprehensive minority language schooling, but even this is not sufficient to assure full reproduction. So, for example, I know from my own work, the case of the Hungarian minority in Romania, comprehensive parallel schooling funded by the state from kindergarten through university, but even so, this Hungarian minority is shrinking over time as some children opt out of the minority language school system, and as intermarriage often leads to intergenerational assimilation. Same thing's happening for the Swedish minority in Finland, and one could mention other examples. So beyond comprehensive minority language schooling, a linguistic regime that constrains people's choices may be necessary to ensure the full reproduction of minority languages. So an example would be the Quebec policy that restricts who can attend English language schools, and it notably requires almost all new immigrants to attend Francophone schools, which again underscores the role of the state, the crucial role of the state in linguistic reproduction. Now you might think that this argument is blatantly contradicted by sharp increases in linguistic pluralism in the US or in any other country of high immigration, countries which do not provide comprehensive minority language schooling or any strong state support for immigrant languages. And of course, it's true that immigration does increase linguistic heterogeneity, and that effect is intensified when immigrants cluster in metropolitan areas where there are dense networks of mother tongue institutions and maybe media markets and so on. But all of this is mainly about the generation of pluralism. It's not about the reproduction. Because in the US, at least, continuing large-scale immigration masks a substantial degree of intergenerational linguistic assimilation. So the model set forth a half-century ago by sociolinguist Joshua Fishman about language shift among second and third generation immigrants remains largely valid. It changes a little bit, that is thickening transnational ties, weakening assimilationist pressures, and the growth of some substantial foreign language media markets have slowed down the process, at least for some groups. So as some demographers have shown in the US, this is true for the descendants of Spanish-speaking immigrants in the US. But even, what's the crucial point is that even for this group, that is the majority of the third generation grandchildren, that is, of Spanish-speaking immigrants, a majority speak only English at home. So the reproduction of minority languages in contemporary liberal societies requires a massive and ordinarily state-provided educational apparatus, and it may also require some territorial regime that limits language choices. And such arrangements are in place in historically multilingual states as a legacy of earlier nationalist struggles. over the language of public life. So this is the case in Canada or Belgium or Spain or Switzerland or India, or you could say even here in Ireland. But no such arrangements protect minority languages generated by recent immigration. There are various forms of de facto bilingualism or multilingualism that have emerged in the US or other countries of immigration. These are significant as pragmatic ways of accommodating linguistic pluralism, but they are not intended to, and they do not work so as to reproduce that linguistic pluralism generated by immigration intergenerationally. Whereas the religious pluralism generated by immigration is more easily reproduced. It's not automatically reproduced. The religious landscape of contemporary societies, as I've suggested already, is fluid. I've noted above the importance of conversion and so on. But the intergenerational transmission of minority religions doesn't require any kind of massive state apparatus like a minority language school system. And it doesn't require any particular legal regime beyond the commitment to religious freedom that's a constitutive element of liberal polities. Moreover, the transmission of religion isn't particularly costly. The transmission of a language beyond what is simply picked up in the home requires a major effort and carries a substantial opportunity cost. But the transmission of a religious affiliation or identification does not. Now, of course, what's transmitted may be little more than a nominal religious affiliation or identification, and that's led some theorists to speak of symbolic religiosity, just as an earlier generation had spoken of symbolic ethnicity. But this nominal religious affiliation or identity can later be revived or reconstructed. And the ethnographic literature has demonstrated that some second and third generation Muslim immigrants in Western countries, for example, are more pious than their parents or grandparents, or, without necessarily being more pious, have constructed new forms of Muslim religiosity. And the same has been true of many American immigrant groups. And this intergenerational staying power of religion results in significant part from the ways in which religious practices can be flexibly adapted and flexibly reconstructed in response to changing circumstances in ways that have no real analog with language. So among descendants of immigrants, religion offers a more enduring locus for cultural pluralism intergenerationally than does language. There's nothing in the domain of religion that's analogous to the characteristic pattern of language shift for second and third generation immigrants. So while linguistic competences and identifications pretty steadily erode over time and are generally only vestigial by the third generation, religious practices and identifications are likely to persist and may even grow strong. So I turn now to the third and final reason for the greater robustness of religious than linguistic pluralism, which is that religious pluralism is institutionalized and legitimized as an enduring presence in liberal societies in ways that linguistic pluralism is not. Both ideologically and institutionally, contemporary liberal states tend to be pluralist with respect to religion and monist or assimilationist with respect to language. Now, their stance towards religion is an attenuated kind of pluralism, not like the more far-reaching kind of pluralism found, say, in some empires and post-colonial polities where different systems of personal law govern members of different religious communities. But even this attenuated pluralism towards religion represents a sharp reversal of the historical pattern in the Christian world in which states had previously been strongly monist or assimilationist with respect to religion and pluralist with respect to language, or more accurately, simply indifferent to linguistic diversity. One sees this pluralist stance and the differing stances towards religious and linguistic pluralism. One sees this clearly in the fact that immigrants are not expected anywhere in the world of liberal polities, and not expected to adopt the prevailing religion, but they are expected to learn the prevailing language, or one of the prevailing languages. The liberal state is expected to be neutral with respect to religion, even if it is not, for reasons I've already suggested, never fully neutral in practice, but there's no such expectation of neutrality with respect to language. So, for example, language tests for citizenship are routine, but one can't really imagine a religious test for citizenship in a liberal polity. Enduring religious pluralism is not just normatively accepted in liberal states, but it's also institutionally supported. Now, I've just noted a moment ago that historically multilingual states or bilingual states do provide strong institutional support for linguistic pluralism, but that strong pluralist stance never is extended to immigrants. So with vis-a-vis immigrants, I don't need to suggest that liberal states are harshly or even actively assimilationist towards immigrant languages, although, as I and others have argued, there has been a shift in the last decade back towards a more moderately assimilationist stance from a previously more differentialist stance. But the point I want to underscore here is that there's a sharp distinction, a distinction both normative and empirical and institutional, between endogenous or historically established forms of linguistic pluralism and imported linguistic pluralism, the kind of pluralism that arises through recent immigration. That is, international minority rights regimes mandate expansive protections for long-established minority languages, but only minimal protections for immigrant languages. And those states that I've mentioned before that provide elaborate institutional support for historically established minority languages provide nothing at all remotely comparable for immigrant languages. And now, again, I want to be clear, liberal countries of immigration do accommodate linguistic pluralism that's generated by immigration in various ways. They may provide some signage, they may provide information, they may provide voting materials or bureaucratic forms in minority languages. They may even provide translators in some medical or legal or administrative settings. They may provide various forms of bilingual education, but all of these are pragmatic accommodations of linguistic heterogeneity arising from immigration that are categorically distinct from the kinds of comprehensive parallel school systems that, or systems of territorial autonomy that are designed to facilitate the long-term reproduction and preservation of more than one language within a single state. So there's a sharp distinction between endogenous and imported linguistic pluralism. But there's a key contrast with religion, because there is no correspondingly sharp distinction between endogenous and imported religious pluralism. So this is a key point, and I want to restate it in a somewhat different form. Rights and protections for long-established minority languages are never extended to immigrant languages. So linguistic settlements, whatever their nature, linguistic settlements are not expandable to include immigrant languages. But religious settlements are expandable to include immigrant religions. Not easily or automatically expandable, but they are expandable. That is, many of the rights and recognitions enjoyed by long-established religions have been extended to immigrant religions. Liberal states have various differing, historically conditioned modes of accommodating religious pluralism, that is, internal religious pluralism. But whatever that established mode of accommodation, they face non-trivial pressures to accommodate immigrant religions on similar terms. And these pressures have no counterpart in the domain of language. The most salient contemporary instance, of course, concerns the accommodation of Islam in Northern and Western Europe. Obviously, it's impossible to do justice to this complex and vexed issue here, but consider just one example from the domain of education. Accommodation on similar terms would mean providing or permitting Islamic education in public schools in countries in which religious instruction in public schools is the norm, or it would mean subsidizing private Islamic schools in countries where such subsidies are provided to other private religious schools. Now, moves to accommodate Islam in this and other domains have been halting and uneven and controversial, and many Muslims claim with considerable justice that the measures taken have not even come close to realizing equal treatment. And of course, one can point to spectacular counterexamples in other domains, such as the ban on the face covering niqab that has been enacted in France and is under discussion elsewhere, or the Swiss referendum banning the construction of minarets. But if one looks beyond these cases of highly mediatized contestation, one can see a steady, if slow, if contested, if often grudging movement towards accommodation in the educational sphere and in other domains. And this has been driven by the courts, on the one hand, which have been receptive to parity claims, to claims for equal treatment. And it's also been driven, on the other hand, by a statist and securitarian concern to manage and domesticate and supervise Muslim populations on the other, to nationalize, as it were, transnational Islam. So having argued now that religious pluralism tends to be more robustly generated, more robustly reproduced, and more robustly institutionalized than linguistic pluralism, I want to move on and to argue, I'll move more quickly here, that the accommodation of religious pluralism in liberal polities is also more likely to generate difficult and sometimes intractable problems of what has been called deep diversity. Now, this is obviously not true for all forms of religious pluralism, insofar as religious heterogeneity involves individualized, subjectivized, or otherwise privatized forms of religious experience or observance. It's easily accommodated in liberal polities, and much of the recent pluralization of the religious landscape in liberal societies, as I suggested earlier, has indeed involved the proliferation of new forms of individualized religiosity and spirituality that do conform to the expectations of secularization theory about the long-term privatization and depoliticization of religion. But, as I also mentioned earlier, recent decades have also witnessed a significant counter-trend towards the deprivatization and repoliticization of religion. And I'm concerned here with this public, organized, and collective forms of religious life, not with the private, individualized forms. Now, what about language? In the era of modern nationalism, language has been widely understood to be the chief criterion and the main cultural substrate of nationhood. And as a result, territorially concentrated linguistic minorities have been understood by ethnopolitical entrepreneurs on the one hand, but also by central state elites on the other, understood as a threat to the territorial integrity of the state and to national identity. So even where secession or territorial autonomy has been implausible, language conflicts have been endemic, precisely for the reasons I mentioned earlier, things like the expansion of state employment, the introduction of universal schooling, universal male military service, the growing importance of what Gellner called context-free communication in an urban, mobile, literate society. All of these have made language a crucial form of cultural capital, a central focus of personal and collective identity, and a key terrain of political struggle. So I'm not underestimating the endemic quality of language conflict in the modern world, but I do want to argue that language conflict has lost some of its intensity and transformative potential in recent decades. Why? Partly because of the vast reorganization of political space along national and, for the most part, broadly linguistic lines throughout Europe and Eurasia, which has reduced, though not eliminated, the scope for new language-based national claims. The reorganization of political space along broadly linguistic lines has involved not only the creation of scores of new independent states, but also the internal reorganization of multi-level states to create linguistically more homogeneous constituent states, as in India, for example. And that includes various forms of federalism and territorial devolution that have allowed autonomous but non-sovereign polities like Quebec or Catalonia or the Basque Country or Wales to pursue their own linguistic agendas. These various reorganizations of political space along broadly linguistic lines have made numerous polities more linguistically homogeneous, bracketing the effects of immigration, and the heterogeneity that remains is widely seen as more legitimate and less threatening. In the geopolitically relaxed zones of Northern and Western Europe, the Americas, and Australia and New Zealand, states no longer seek to impose the same tight coupling of culture, territory, and population that was central to the nationalizing projects of a century ago. And in this region, at any rate, linguistic diversity is not only tolerated, but in some cases, it's even celebrated. And even in the East Central European locus classicus of nationalist language conflicts, even here, the eastward expansion of the EU, the institutionalization of minority language rights, have taken some of the edge off of these formerly intractable ethno-linguistic conflicts. Or in the US, there are conflicts over the status of Spanish that flare up periodically. But more striking is the continuing piecemeal, pragmatic, and largely uncontested accommodation of Spanish and other languages in a variety of less visible settings. So yes, language remains reign of chronic struggle in multilingual polities worldwide, especially where linguistic minorities are territorially concentrated. But in liberal polities, with some exceptions, and notably and most obviously in Belgium, with some exceptions, these struggles have become less intense and less intractable in recent decades. But while language conflicts, I would argue, have eased somewhat in recent decades, conflicts over religion have intensified, driven by the resurgence of public religion. As a universal and inescapable medium of public life, language can never be fully privatized or depoliticized, whereas religion could, in principle, be fully privatized and depoliticized. But the mid-20th century Western vision of a fully privatized religion has proved entirely chimerical. And to the extent that religion is not then privatized or depoliticized, the conflicts arising from